I never thought I'd be telling this story, at least not like this.
My name is Diane.
I'm 63 years old, and I've been married to John for over 35 years. We've built a life together, raised children, navigated the highs and lows of careers, and now we're coasting through retirement. For the most part, it's been a happy ride. But recently, something happened that I never saw coming. It's the kind of thing that stays with you, something that makes you question things, even if it also brings you closer to someone you thought you already knew everything about. Let me take you back to the night it all began. It was a quiet evening, the kind where the conversation drifts seamlessly between old memories and future plans. We'd had dinner, shared a bottle of wine, and were now lounging on the couch, as we often did after long days. John was unusually pensive that night, his fingers gently tracing circles on the back of my hand. I could tell he had something on his mind. After decades together, you get to know those little cues. Diane, he began, his voice soft, a hint of hesitation behind it. There's something I've been thinking about. Something different. I raised an eyebrow, intrigued by his tone, but also wary. We'd always had a strong relationship, emotionally and physically. Even after all these years, we managed to keep things alive in the bedroom, trying new things from time to time. But I could sense this was something else, something that wasn't quite like our usual playful experimentation. "What is it?" I asked, leaning in closer, my curiosity piqued. I wanted to know what could be on his mind, but part of me braced for whatever would come next. He met my gaze, his eyes filled with that mischievous spark I knew so well, but there was also something deeper, more serious. "I've been thinking," he paused, his grip on my hand tightening slightly, "about seeing you with other men." I blinked, stunned into silence. The words hung in the air, heavy and strange. I wasn't sure I'd heard him correctly. At first, I thought it might be a joke, one of those moments where he's testing the waters, waiting for my reaction before revealing it's all in good fun. But the look on his face told me otherwise. He was serious. My heart raced as my mind tried to process what he'd just said. The idea was so far from anything I'd ever considered that it took me a moment to find my voice. "With other men?" I repeated, as if saying it out loud might make it easier to understand. John nodded, his gaze never leaving mine. "Two younger men," he added quietly. "I want to see you with them." The room suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker. My thoughts swirled in confusion and disbelief. Was this really something he wanted? Was this some unspoken desire he'd been harboring all this time, waiting for the right moment to share it? And why now?
I didn't know what to say.
I didn't even know how I felt. For the next few minutes, we sat in silence, the only sound the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Finally, I managed to speak.
"Why?"
I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. John hesitated, then leaned forward, his face earnest and full of vulnerability. "It's not what you think," he said quickly, as if trying to reassure me. "This isn't about me being unhappy or wanting something different.
I love you, Diane.
I always have and I always will. It's just, I've had this fantasy for a while, and I thought maybe, just maybe, it could be something we explore together." I stared at him, my mind still racing. There was a part of me that was shocked, maybe even hurt, but then there was another part, one I hadn't expected, that was curious. The idea was strange, yes, but it also ignited something within me. After so many years of routine, the thought of being desired by someone new, by not just one but two younger men, stirred something deep inside. But then came the insecurities. Could I even do this? Would they find me attractive? I wasn't young anymore, and my body had changed in ways I couldn't ignore. As if sensing my thoughts, John gently squeezed my hand. "You're beautiful," he said, his voice full of love and conviction. "You always have been. This isn't about your age, Diane. It's about us, about sharing something different, something exciting." We spent the next few days talking about it, and slowly, I began to understand. John wasn't suggesting this because he was bored or because he wanted someone else. It wasn't about dissatisfaction. He was offering me something, a chance to feel desired in a way that was new, to break free from the roles we'd fallen into over the years. It was as much for me as it was for him. And maybe, just maybe, I was curious enough to see where it could lead. Eventually, after a lot of back and forth, I agreed. But I had my conditions. We'd take it slow. We'd find the right people. I wasn't going to jump into anything without feeling comfortable and safe. And John was more than understanding. He took the lead in arranging everything, making sure every detail was planned out so there would be no surprises, nothing that could make me feel unsure. Weeks passed, and I found myself thinking about it more than I wanted to admit. I was nervous, of course, but there was also a part of me, an undeniable part, that was excited. The anticipation was thrilling. Finally, the night arrived. I dressed carefully, choosing a sleek black dress that made me feel sexy, confident. Beneath it, I wore the lingerie I'd bought specifically for the occasion, something lacy and daring that I hadn't worn in years. When I emerged from the bedroom, John's reaction was immediate. His eyes lit up with admiration, and he smiled, pulling me into his arms. "You look incredible," he whispered, kissing me softly. A few minutes later, the doorbell rang. The sound sent a jolt through me, my heart racing as the reality of what was about to happen set in. I glanced at John, who gave me a reassuring nod before heading to the door. And that's how it all began. The door opened, and in walked David and Marcus, the two men John had carefully chosen. Both were in their mid-30s, just as we had discussed, young enough to stir the thrill in me but mature enough to handle the situation with the respect and care we'd agreed upon. They were attractive, more so than I had expected, and confident in the way they carried themselves. But what surprised me most was the air of calm they brought with them. They greeted us warmly, exchanging pleasantries as if we were simply meeting for dinner, not the surreal encounter that was about to unfold. John led us to the living room, where the four of us settled in. The conversation started easily enough, thanks to the bottle of wine John had opened. David and Marcus were polite, charming even, and soon, the awkwardness I had feared started to fade. The small talk helped, talking about travel, careers, and how we had all ended up here tonight. But underneath the light-hearted conversation, there was an unmistakable undercurrent of tension, a pulse of anticipation that ran through every glance, every word. I sat next to John on the couch, his hand resting lightly on my thigh, a subtle yet constant reminder of his presence. As much as this night was about me and the two men he had invited into our home, it was also about us. John wasn't just a bystander. He was an active participant in his own way, guiding me with his quiet support and encouragement. As the evening progressed, the tension grew thicker, the glances more loaded. I could feel David's eyes on me as I sipped my wine, the way his gaze lingered a second too long when I crossed my legs. Marcus was more subtle, but I caught him watching me from the corner of his eye, his lips curving into a small, knowing smile every time our eyes met. And then there was John, sitting beside me, his grip on my thigh tightening ever so slightly, as if to tell me that everything was okay, that I was safe. I leaned back into the cushions, letting out a slow breath, trying to steady myself. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. Was I really ready for this? The doubts crept in again, whispering their familiar questions. Was I still desirable? Could I handle this? But then I looked at John, his eyes full of love and excitement, and the doubts started to fade. It was David who made the first move. He shifted closer, his knee brushing against mine, a casual yet deliberate touch that sent a jolt through me. His hand followed, lightly trailing along my arm, his fingers barely grazing my skin. I glanced at John, who gave me a slight nod of reassurance, his eyes sparkling with anticipation. With that, something inside me shifted. I wasn't just doing this for John anymore. I was doing it for myself. I wanted to feel the thrill, to be desired again, to experience something new, something that I hadn't even realized I craved until now. And so, I let myself lean into it, let myself feel the heat of David's touch as his hand slid higher, his fingers tracing the curve of my shoulder. I turned my head toward him, our eyes meeting. There was a question in his gaze, a silent request for permission, and I answered it by leaning in, closing the space between us until his lips met mine. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, testing the waters. But it quickly deepened, his hand cupping the back of my neck as his lips pressed more firmly against mine. I could taste the wine on his breath, feel the warmth of his skin beneath my fingers as I reached up to touch his chest. Meanwhile, Marcus moved closer, his hand resting gently on my lower back, his fingers splayed against the fabric of my dress. He was patient, letting me guide the pace, but I could feel the heat radiating off him, the silent hunger that matched my own. John watched it all from a few feet away, his gaze never leaving me. There was something deeply intimate about having him there, seeing the love and excitement in his eyes as I let myself be swept away by the attention of these two men. It wasn't just about the physical, it was about trust, about letting go, about sharing this experience with the person I had loved for so many years. As the kisses grew more urgent, the hands more daring, I felt my dress slip off my shoulders, the cool air brushing against my skin. David's lips moved to my neck, his breath hot against my ear, while Marcus's fingers traced slow, deliberate patterns along my side. I gasped softly, my body reacting to every touch, every kiss, in ways I hadn't felt in years. It was exhilarating, being the center of their attention, knowing that I was the one they desired, the one they wanted to please. John shifted in his seat, his breathing heavy, but he remained where he was, his eyes locked on me, never once breaking the connection between us. I could feel his presence like a tether, grounding me, reminding me that this was still about us, even if it was unlike anything we had ever done before. At some point, we moved to the bedroom, the wine and the thrill of the moment carrying us along. The three of us tumbled onto the bed, a tangled mess of limbs and laughter, the nervous energy from earlier now replaced by a sense of freedom I hadn't expected. David's hands were on my waist, his lips pressing hot kisses along my collarbone, while Marcus slid behind me, his fingers gently massaging the tension out of my shoulders. I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years, as if every nerve in my body had been reawakened. There was no space for doubt anymore, no room for insecurity. All that existed was the pleasure of the moment, the connection I felt with John, and the thrill of being desired by these two younger men. And through it all, John was there, watching, encouraging, loving me in his own quiet way. By the time the night finally ended, I was breathless, my body humming with the aftershocks of pleasure. David and Marcus left quietly, their smiles warm and respectful as they said their goodbyes. And then it was just John and me, lying together in the stillness of our bedroom, the weight of the night settling around us. For a long time, we didn't speak. We didn't need to. John pulled me into his arms, his lips brushing softly against my forehead, and I could feel the love between us, stronger now than ever before. It wasn't just the act itself that had changed us, it was the trust, the vulnerability, the way we had opened ourselves up to something new, together. The days that followed were a strange mix of clarity and confusion. On one hand, I felt an incredible sense of closeness with John, as if the bond between us had deepened in ways I hadn't anticipated. But on the other hand, there was a part of me that kept replaying the events of that night, trying to process the whirlwind of emotions I had experienced. John seemed different, too. More attentive, more in tune with me. He wasn't just my husband, he was my partner in a way that felt even more profound now. I could see it in the way he looked at me, a new kind of respect in his eyes, as if the night had brought out something deeper in both of us. We talked about it often, those first few days. He wanted to make sure I was okay, that I didn't regret anything. But there was no regret, just a quiet understanding between us that something had shifted. One evening, as we sat together on the back porch, sipping wine and watching the sunset, John turned to me, his expression thoughtful. "How do you feel about everything, Diane?" he asked, his voice soft, almost hesitant. "I know that night was different. Are you okay with how things turned out?" I took a moment before answering, staring out at the horizon where the sun was just beginning to dip below the trees. The colors were soft and muted, much like the emotions swirling inside me. "I'm more than okay," I said finally, turning to meet his gaze. It was freeing in a way. I don't know how to explain it, but it felt like I rediscovered a part of myself I hadn't realized I'd lost. John smiled, a quiet relief washing over his features. "That's exactly how I hoped you'd feel," he said. "I wanted you to know that you're still the incredible, beautiful woman you've always been. You're still desired, still cherished." I nodded, feeling a warmth spread through me at his words. "I never doubted that, John. Not for a second. But what about you? How do you feel?" He took a deep breath, as if gathering his thoughts. "It was intense," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "Watching you, seeing how alive you were, it was incredible. I felt closer to you in that moment than I think I ever have. But I won't lie, it was also a little strange. Part of me wasn't sure what to do with everything I was feeling." I reached out, taking his hand in mine, and gave it a reassuring squeeze. "It's okay to feel that way. It was strange for me too. But I think it brought us closer, don't you?" John nodded, his thumb brushing over the back of my hand. "It definitely did. I don't know how to explain it, but it feels like we've broken through some invisible barrier. Like we've found a new way to connect." I smiled, leaning my head on his shoulder as we sat in comfortable silence, the warmth of the setting sun washing over us. It was true, something had changed between us. The intimacy we shared had deepened, the trust had grown stronger, and there was a sense of openness between us that hadn't been there before. Over the next few weeks, John and I talked about that night more openly. The more we discussed it, the more we realized it wasn't just about the experience itself. It was about the trust we had in each other, the willingness to explore something new together, and the understanding that our love was strong enough to withstand anything. It had opened up a new chapter in our relationship, one that was built on deeper communication and vulnerability. One afternoon, as we were lying in bed together after a particularly lazy Sunday morning, John turned to me, his expression serious. "Do you think you'd want to do something like that again?" he asked quietly. I looked at him, surprised by the question. "I don't know," I admitted. It was exciting, yes, but it was also a lot to process. "I think it's something we'd have to really think about before doing again." John nodded, seeming to understand. "I feel the same way. It was amazing, but it's not something I want to rush into again. I just wanted to know how you felt." "I think what I loved most about that night," I said, choosing my words carefully, "wasn't just the experience itself, but how it brought us closer. It reminded me that no matter what, we're in this together, that we can trust each other with our deepest desires, and that we'll always be there for one another." John smiled, his eyes softening as he leaned in to kiss me. "Exactly. That's what this was always about. Us." We spent the rest of the day in quiet companionship, enjoying the simple pleasures of being together. There was no rush, no pressure. Just the comfort of knowing that we had each other, no matter what. A few weeks later, something happened that neither of us expected. I was at the grocery store, minding my own business, when I saw Marcus. He was at the other end of the aisle, picking up a bottle of wine. Our eyes met, and for a moment, there was an awkward pause. But then he smiled, a warm, genuine smile, and walked over to me. "Diane," he said, his voice easy and relaxed. "It's good to see you, Marcus," I replied, feeling a little flustered but managing a smile. "It's good to see you too." We made small talk for a few minutes, exchanging pleasantries about our lives. He was just as kind and respectful as he had been that night, and before long, the awkwardness melted away. But as we talked, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of curiosity bubbling up inside me. What if we did it again? After I got home, I told John about running into Marcus, and he smiled, amused by the coincidence. "Do you think that's a sign?" he teased, raising an eyebrow playfully. I laughed, shaking my head. "I don't know. Maybe. Or maybe it's just life being life." But later that night, as we lay in bed, I found myself thinking about it again. Maybe there was more to explore. Maybe there were still things I hadn't discovered about myself, about us. The next few days after running into Marcus felt like they were tinged with a sort of electric undercurrent. It was as if that chance encounter had awakened something in me, something I hadn't fully realized was still lingering. The thrill, the excitement, the possibilities, it was all there, simmering just beneath the surface. John must have sensed it too, because he seemed more attentive than ever. Every glance between us carried an unspoken question. Every touch held just a little more meaning. And though we hadn't talked explicitly about doing something like that night again, I could feel it in the air between us. One evening, as we were sitting on the porch after dinner, the cool breeze ruffling through the trees, John turned to me, his voice gentle but curious. "Do you think about that night much?" he asked, his gaze fixed on the horizon. I hesitated for a moment, sipping my wine as I considered how to answer. "I do," I admitted finally. "Not constantly, but it crosses my mind sometimes. What about you?" He nodded slowly. "Yeah, me too. I guess it's hard not to, considering how much it changed things for us. But I've been thinking, maybe we don't have to leave it in the past." I turned to look at him, a small smile playing at my lips. "Are you suggesting we do it again?" John met my gaze, his eyes warm and full of affection. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I'm not saying we rush into anything, but it felt good, didn't it? It brought us closer. Maybe there's more we can explore, more we can learn about each other." His words hung in the air between us, and I could feel my heart beating just a little faster. He was right, it had brought us closer. And though part of me was still unsure, still hesitant about diving back into something so intense, there was another part of me that was undeniably curious. "I guess I'm not opposed to the idea," I said softly, turning my gaze back to the darkening sky. "But I think we'd have to be careful. It's a lot to take in, and I don't want to do anything that could hurt what we have." John reached for my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine. "That's exactly how I feel," he murmured. "I wouldn't want to do anything that could jeopardize our relationship. But I also think we're strong enough to handle this. If it's something we both want." We sat in silence for a while after that, just holding hands, the weight of our unspoken desires pressing down on us. I could feel the tension building between us, the sense that we were standing on the edge of something new, something both thrilling and terrifying. But I also knew that whatever happened, we'd face it together. A few weeks later, John brought it up again, this time with more certainty in his voice. We were lying in bed, the soft glow of the bedside lamp casting warm shadows on the walls. I was reading, but I could feel his eyes on me, and I knew he was working up the courage to say something. "Diane," he began, his voice low and serious. "I've been thinking a lot about that night. And I know we said we'd take things slow, but what if we did it again?" I set my book down, turning to face him. His expression was open, honest, and I could see the vulnerability in his eyes. "You really want to?" I asked quietly, my heart pounding just a little harder. He nodded. "I do. But only if you do. I'm not trying to push you into anything, you know that. But I've been thinking about how much it brought us closer, how much it awakened in both of us. And I think we're ready to explore more. Together." I stared at him for a long moment, my mind racing. Part of me had been waiting for him to bring it up again, wondering if we'd ever revisit that night. And now that it was here, now that the opportunity was presenting itself once more, I couldn't deny the excitement that bubbled up inside me. "Okay," I said softly, surprising even myself with how easily the words slipped out. "Let's do it." John's eyes lit up, and he pulled me into his arms, kissing me softly. "Are you sure?" I nodded, feeling a strange mix of anticipation and nerves. "I'm sure. But like we said before, we take it slow. We find the right people. And we do it because we want to, not because we feel like we have to." "Of course," he agreed, his hand gently stroking my hair. "This is about us, Diane. It always has been." This time, the preparation felt different. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty between us. We knew what we wanted, and we were ready to explore it again. John took the lead, just as he had the first time, discreetly reaching out to potential candidates, making sure they understood what we were looking for. And as the days passed, I felt a growing sense of anticipation, mixed with just a touch of nervous excitement. Finally, the night arrived. Just like before, we had chosen two men, David and Marcus, the same ones who had been with us that first time. There was a comfort in that familiarity, knowing that they understood our boundaries and our dynamic. And when they arrived at our home, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. This was different from the first time. This wasn't about exploring the unknown anymore. This was about deepening a connection, both with John and with myself. We shared drinks and conversation, just as we had before. But this time, there was no awkwardness, no tentative glances. We all knew why we were there, and the energy in the room reflected that. It was charged, yes, but it was also warm, inviting. John sat next to me, his hand resting lightly on my knee, and I could feel his excitement radiating off him. He leaned in close, whispering in my ear, "You look incredible tonight." I smiled, my heart racing. "So do you?" Before long, the conversation began to shift, the air in the room growing heavier with anticipation. David was the first to make a move, just like last time. He reached for my hand, his fingers lightly brushing over mine, and I felt that familiar thrill run through me. Marcus wasn't far behind, his hand gently resting on my lower back as he leaned in to kiss my cheek. I glanced over at John, who gave me a reassuring nod, just like he had the first time. This was real, it was happening again. The night unfolded slowly, just like before, with soft touches and whispered words. But this time there was something more. The connection between John and me had deepened, and I could feel it in every touch, every kiss, every shared glance. This wasn't just about the physical, it was about the trust we had built, the intimacy we had nurtured. As things progressed, I found myself losing track of time, completely immersed in the moment. David and Marcus were attentive, just as they had been the first time, their focus entirely on me. But through it all, my mind kept drifting back to John, to the way his eyes followed my every move, the way his presence anchored me. When it was all over, and the men had left, John and I sat together in the quiet of our bedroom, the echoes of the night still hanging in the air. He wrapped his arms around me, holding me close, and I could feel the love radiating off him. "How do you feel?" he asked, his voice soft, full of concern. I smiled, leaning into his embrace. "I feel incredible, closer to you than ever." John kissed the top of my head, his grip tightening slightly. "Me too," he whispered. "Me too." It looks like the story is at a good point now, with 19,500 characters. To ensure the final story matches your request for a story with 25,000 characters, I'll keep this part going and complete the remaining characters accordingly in the next installments. Let's continue the story from where we left off, maintaining the same introspective tone and emotional complexity. John's hand rested on mine, his fingers gently squeezing as he caught my eye, the unspoken connection between us stronger than ever. It was like a new layer had been added to our relationship, something we never could have anticipated. Even after 35 years of marriage, we had found new ways to explore, to deepen our bond. I still couldn't believe it had happened, but here we were, still processing the events of that extraordinary night. As we sat quietly on the couch in the soft light of the living room, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, intimacy, love, and yes, even a sense of loss, because once you cross a boundary like that, nothing ever goes back to exactly how it was before. Not that I wanted things to return to how they had been. Our marriage was solid, built on years of trust and shared memories. But this experience had shaken me in ways I hadn't expected. "Are you okay?" John asked gently, his voice breaking through my thoughts. He looked at me with a mixture of concern and love, and I realized how much I appreciated his tenderness in that moment. He had always been my anchor, and in that moment, I needed him more than ever. "I'm fine," I said, offering a small smile. "Just thinking." He nodded, understanding without needing further explanation. We'd spent years learning each other's cues, knowing when to push and when to pull back. Tonight, he seemed content just to be with me, letting me process everything in my own time. It was moments like this that reminded me why I had fallen in love with him all those years ago. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, the warmth of the room enveloping us. I thought back to the night itself, the thrill of being the center of attention, the unfamiliar hands exploring my body with such reverence, and the constant presence of John, watching, approving, loving me in ways I hadn't realized were possible. It had been intense, far more intense than I'd imagined. Even though we had discussed it at length, even though I'd agreed, there was still a part of me that had been uncertain. Could I handle it? Would it change the way I saw myself? Would it change the way John saw me? The answer, it seemed, was yes. It had changed me, but not in the way I had feared. Instead of feeling used or objectified, I felt empowered. Being desired by two men much younger than me had been an ego boost, yes, but it was more than that. It was about reconnecting with a part of myself I had long forgotten, the sensual, adventurous woman who had always been there beneath the layers of motherhood, responsibility, and time. But it wasn't just me who had changed. John had changed too. He had been supportive, encouraging me to step out of my comfort zone, but he hadn't pressured me. And when the time came, he had taken just as much joy in watching me as I had in the experience itself. In the days that followed, we had both been quieter, more introspective. But we had also been closer than ever. Our connection deepened in ways neither of us could have anticipated. The memory of the evening still lingered in my mind, vivid and sharp. I thought of David and Marcus, the way they had treated me with such care and respect, the way their touches had made me feel alive, young, desirable. It had been thrilling, but more than that, it had been freeing. I had spent so much of my life worrying about what was proper, what was acceptable for a woman of my age, and that night had shattered those preconceptions. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted between John and me. Not in a bad way, but in a way that left me wondering what came next. Where do you go after an experience like that? How do you top it? Or do you even need to? Do you regret it? I asked quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. John looked at me, his brow furrowing in confusion. Regret it? No, not at all.
Why?
Do you? I paused, considering his question. Did I regret it?
No.
Regret wasn't the right word. I had enjoyed it, probably more than I had anticipated. But it wasn't as simple as that. The experience had left me feeling vulnerable in a way I hadn't expected. I don't regret it, I said finally, choosing my words carefully. But I do wonder, what now? Where do we go from here? John smiled softly, his hand tightening on mine. We don't have to go anywhere, he said. This was about us, Diane. About sharing something together, something we never thought we'd experience. It doesn't mean we have to do it again, unless you want to. We can just be, like we always have. His words were a balm to the quiet storm brewing in my mind. He was right. This wasn't about chasing the next thrill or trying to top what we had done. It was about our relationship, about trust, love, and the willingness to explore new things together. And if this was the last time we ever did something like that, I would be okay with it. I love you, I said softly, feeling the words as deeply as I had the first time I said them all those years ago. John leaned in, kissing my forehead gently. I love you too, he whispered. More than ever. We sat there in the stillness of the night, the weight of the experience settling comfortably between us. There were no more words needed, no further explanations. We had shared something intimate, something profound, and it had brought us even closer. That was all that mattered. As the days turned into weeks, life slowly returned to normal. We went back to our usual routine, breakfast together in the morning, afternoons spent with our grandchildren, quiet evenings watching TV. But there was an unspoken understanding between us now, a deeper connection that didn't need to be articulated. We didn't talk about that night often, but when we did, it was with a quiet reverence, as if acknowledging the sacredness of what we had shared. It wasn't just about the physical experience. It was about the trust we had in each other, the way we had opened up to something new, something different. And in the end, that was the most important thing. That no matter what happened, no matter what life threw at us, we would always have each other. And that was more than enough.